It goes without saying, but Samoa Joe is one of the all-time greats. Emerging from an era that produced the likes of Bryan Danielson and CM Punk, Samoa Joe is a part of a dying breed of professional wrestlers. These are the types of wrestlers who came up in an era where options were limited, and therefore, they took matters into their own hands. Instead of waiting for an opportunity to present itself, these guys poured their heart and soul into the only place that accepted them at the time, the independent wrestling scene. What resulted was an era that we now look back on as the golden age of independent wrestling. These guys put a promotion like Ring of Honor on the map and carved the path for those who came after them, such as Kevin Steen and El Generico. Many tend to consider wrestlers from that era, such as Bryan Danielson, CM Punk, and AJ Styles, some of the greatest wrestlers to ever live. But what about Samoa Joe? He was arguably the most important piece in all of this as the longtime final boss, and yet I feel like he rarely gets the all-time great level praise that his contemporaries do. Sure, we all know Samoa Joe is a beast, but it's time we give him his flowers for both his work in the past and his work in the present, whether it's ROH, TNA, WWE, and now AEW. Whenever called upon, Samoa Joe has proven that he excels in every facet of professional wrestling. And finally, all that hard work spent on the indies and all those times where other companies didn't give him the ball has paid off. It's time we celebrate Samoa Joe for what he is, a living legend. This is a story of comebacks, a story of champions. This is from fired to world champion, Samoa Joe. I'm gonna say this now because I know people are gonna say it anyway. Samoa Joe was a legend of the industry before his runs in both WWE and AEW. I know some people are gonna disagree with that statement, but I'm standing firm. As I said, Samoa Joe was part of a group that made it possible for guys like Seth Rollins and Kevin Owens to break through. His legacy was cemented, with or without ever having wrestled in WWE. Great runs with both ROH and TNA ensured that Joe would forever be remembered by the hardcore wrestling audience, with his ROH run perhaps doing the better of the two. Regardless, when Samoa Joe finally joined WWE, the time was right. He had done everything he could in TNA. Joe deserved that run with the biggest promotion in the world where he could earn the most money. And believe it or not, things started off great. Samoa Joe joined WWE at a time when NXT was being produced as WWE's take of an indie wrestling promotion, and more specifically, ROH. Samoa Joe fit like a glove, and he immediately rose to the top of NXT when he won their world title. Admittedly, Triple H protected Samoa Joe and treated him like the star he was. It was a different story, however, once he got to the main roster. Samoa Joe joined WWE at the best time to be in NXT, but the worst time to be on the main roster. You have to understand that Samoa Joe has it all. He's a killer in the ring, but he's also been criminally underrated on the mic for what feels like the majority of his career up until the last few years. He's got the believable build of a fighting champion who can legit hurt you while talking like a star. He's also constantly been one of the most popular guys on the roster no matter where he goes. The thing is, Joe's run with WWE once he moved up to the main roster seemed snake-bitten. Although he did get the chance to wrestle most of the top guys there like Roman Reigns, Seth Rollins, AJ Styles, and Brock Lesnar, there was always a setback. Joe's main roster run was infamous for the run of unlucky injuries that always seemed to come at the worst time. Just when it seemed he was gaining momentum, an injury would keep him on the sideline. It was apparently serious enough to the point where Joe was moved to commentary, and for 1 year he called the action in the ring before being let go by WWE. I'd like to say I was surprised when it happened, but I wasn't. Clearly WWE thought Joe was damaged goods, and so they cut ties. He was fired. The actual surprising part came 2 months later when Samoa Joe was rehired by WWE at Triple H's request apparently. And it seemed like things were going to be okay now. Joe got another run with the NXT World title, and they fired him again. Yup, months later after having to relinquish the NXT World title due to injury, Samoa Joe was fired by WWE once more. And this time, it was for good. Samoa Joe was with WWE for 7 years, and yet it felt like he had so much left to do. Many questioned whether Joe could still go considering his injury history with the company as well. I'm a bit embarrassed to admit, but I'll say it. I thought Joe's best days were behind him. I was one of those fools who thought his years of grinding, scratching, and clawing finally had caught up to him. But this is one of those times where I'm beyond glad that I was wrong. The first time that Samoa Joe was fired, I had hopes that he'd eventually show up in AEW, but WWE hired him 2 months later, which hardly gave AEW a chance to enter negotiations. This time though, I had a feeling Joe would be welcomed with open arms by the man who had just purchased the company where Joe made his name, Ring of Honor. Yeah, it was a crazy time in AEW. Tony Khan had just purchased Ring of Honor while things were starting to fall apart behind the scenes, unbeknownst to the audience. Ring of Honor was about to have their first show under Tony Khan's ownership, so you knew he was going to want to do something big. And the big surprise was Samoa Joe, who made his debut at the end of the show to a large ovation. It was poetic in a way, bringing back one of the founding fathers of the promotion for this big rebranding show. It was announced that Samoa Joe would be competing with both ROH and AEW, to the excitement of many. Joe quickly became a mainstay on AEW television, making the finals of the Owen Hart tournament only a few weeks after debuting. There was that awkward period afterwards where he formed the short-lived tag team with Wardlow, but at least that led to Joe becoming a double champion by holding the ROH TV title and the TNT title at the same time, the king of television. Then he had a fantastic trilogy with Darby Allin where they traded the TNT title a couple of times before Joe lost the title to Wardlow. Still holding the ROH title, however, Joe would continue to defend that belt, going on a record-breaking run in the process. Then in the summer of 2023, Samoa Joe crossed paths with an old foe, perhaps his greatest foe, CM Punk. The moment that Samoa Joe showed up in AEW, this was the match I wanted to see the most. After their legendary ROH rivalry put both on the map, all I wanted was to see these two share the ring now, being the stars that they are. And it didn't disappoint. Although Samoa Joe long held a winning record against Punk, Punk would go on to beat Joe 2 times in a row. Their second match in AEW, which took place at All In particular, might just be one of my favorite pay-per-view openers of all time. Although Joe was the one who came up short, it would only take a few more months for him to finally get his moment in the sun. A few weeks after All In, Samoa Joe would challenge MJF for the AEW World title at Grand Slam. This match was excellent, but ultimately Joe fell short. I thought this would be the closest we'd ever see Joe get to winning the big one, but again, I'm glad I was wrong. Shortly after, Joe would relinquish the ROH TV title, stating he was only interested in one belt, the AEW World Championship. This saw Joe enter a story where he protected MJF from all that devil stuff until he got his title shot at the last AEW show of the year, World's End. In classic Joe fashion, it turns out he was in cahoots with the devil the whole time and used this to his advantage. At AEW World's End, Samoa Joe had arguably the crowning moment of his entire career. In a match in front of a sold-out crowd in MJF's hometown, Samoa Joe would choke out MJF to become the new AEW World Champion. Sure, Joe held the world titles in ROH, TNA, and even NXT, but to win this one at this stage of his career after all that he had been through over the past few years made it feel like the biggest win of Joe's career. He didn't just beat MJF, he dominated him and ended a reign that lasted over a year. This part of Joe's life is what I like to call vindication. This man was fired twice by WWE, and for all we know, it might have been his life's goal to make it there. After his second firing, he could have moped around or looked for an easy check while phoning it in. Instead, he proved that he could still go. No, he proved that he's still one of the very best in in-ring skill and promos. He proved that he could still be a top guy. And now he's the top guy in AEW. And instantly, Samoa Joe has added to his ever-growing legacy. As I said, Samoa Joe was already a legend of the game before even joining WWE, let alone AEW. But this only adds to the prestigious list of accolades that Joe has accumulated throughout his career. With all due respect to TNA and NXT, Joe has never been the main guy for a mainstream promotion. He should have been. And hell, maybe he would be in today's WWE. But the fact of the matter is, Joe has taken the AEW mantle and taken it with pride. In a time where certain former WWE wrestlers see AEW as beneath them, Samoa Joe has said, to hell with that, I want the ball, give it to me and you won't regret it. And just like that, the feeling has been restored. Joe becoming AEW World Champion is important for both his legacy and AEW as a whole. For the majority of 2023, AEW didn't know what it wanted to be. It had an identity issue, one that I talked about in depth. But all of a sudden, with Joe at the top, the company feels like it did in the beginning. Let the fighting do the talking. And it's no coincidence that as we now return to a more sports-based presentation, Joe is the guy spearheading the entire company back to what hooked people in the first place. Joe isn't just a good wrestler, he isn't just a great wrestler. Samoa Joe is a legend who should be talked about as one of the greatest of all time, alongside the likes of Bryan Danielson, CM Punk, and AJ Styles. The era of wrestlers that never asked for an opportunity, instead they created their own opportunities. Samoa Joe is a large part as to why AEW has gotten off to a promising start in 2024. Not many have the legitimacy in look and skill quite like he does. His promos and matches as world champion feel like the most important thing, and that's what you need in a world champion. So let's give Joe his flowers while he's still at the top of his game. Here's to the AEW World Champion. Here's to one of the greatest of all time. Here's to Samoa Joe.